Hey you guys, I'm Asmara and welcome back to the channel. And today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Life is Strange Double Exposure. So I'm a huge Life is Strange fan and I've played through literally every single one of the main titles on the channel, and the most recent game, the fourth primary installment in the franchise, is Double Exposure, where we got to get reintroduced to Max's character and her story basically continued. So Double Exposure did not end the way I would have hoped, and I'm pretty sure most people kind of shared that same sentiment. They definitely kind of lost the plot a little bit. But this video in particular is not going to be talking about the specifics of like what's wrong with Double Exposure. I feel like enough people make content in that realm. I'm not going to be really talking about the writing much, but I did want to talk a little bit about Safi and Yasmin's character and some of the parallels from their relationship that I've drawn to my own life and also just have observed in the world. So basically the point of this video is to use Double Exposure as a jump off point to talk about larger societal issues. So for starters, something I have realized is I think with the Life is Strange sequels, something I've appreciated is seeing how the writers have tried to implement stories of characters from various ethnic backgrounds. There's definitely a big noticeable difference from the diversity in Life is Strange 1 versus in the most recent game, Life is Strange 4. And even outside of like the main Life is Strange universe, other games that Donut has created, I have seen, some increasing representation either for LGBTQ plus stories or highlighting different characters from different backgrounds. And so something I appreciated with Safi and Yasmin's character in Double Exposure is that they are Arab. I'm not going to be speaking too heavily on, I guess, the accuracy of their depiction. That's just not something I'm personally super experienced or qualified to speak about, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you are a part of that culture, what you thought of the representation, or did you think it wasn't super noticeable? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? But something I did think was interesting is how the game started to explore their relationship, or at least it brushed on the topic of their mother-daughter relationship and Safi's complex relationship with her mom. I honestly think that exploring this deeper would have been really interesting and definitely relatable to a lot of people. By the way, this video will definitely contain spoilers, but as we learn throughout the game, Safi has a kind of a strained relationship with her mom that started in childhood. From what the game articulates, it seems like Yasmin was definitely an overprotective and overbearing parent. Safi ends up mentioning at some point that her mother, Yasmin, prevented Safi from seeing her dad and then blamed it on her dad. And apparently she had done this under the guise of trying to protect Safi, I guess, from the world's harm. Again, they don't go super in depth into the details, but there's various examples of ways that Yasmin was trying to be a protective parent, but in a way that ultimately backfired. There's another line in the game where Safi says that the way that Yasmin was dealing with her own trauma was to make sure that Safi, her daughter, was okay. And as we can kind of piece together, we can kind of see that her focus on trying to make sure her daughter had the quote-unquote perfect life really took away from Yasmin being able to cater to and see Safi's actual needs. And that's something I think a lot of people can resonate with. And I think now that we're in an age of being more open about our childhood, how we were raised, therapy speak, how our childhood has impacted us as an adult, I think a lot of people can relate to this idea of having parents that aren't explicitly bad parents, quote unquote, but haven't always been able to provide us with our needs. This is where Safi's shape-shifting ability comes in. She mentioned in the game that to kind of get away from the pressure that she was experiencing and the performative nature that she had kind of been defaulted to assume, she developed her shape-shifting ability to quite literally become someone else. And I honestly think that that is a metaphor for this idea that Safi wasn't or didn't feel, I guess, good enough in her own skin. The fact that she wanted to become somebody else and wanted to maybe be the daughter that her mother would have hoped quite literally resulted in her being able to shapeshift into other people. And so that's where the supernatural ability comes in. Towards the end of the game, one of Safi's lines says, "The only time that you weren't controlling me," referring to her mother, "was when she wasn't even her." and that is in reference to her shape-shifting ability. So this part of the story, this relationship that Safi has with her mom, definitely stood out to me because there's a few reasons. I think for starters, there's been a lot more conversations in recent years about having a complex relationship with a mother figure. Like just off top, I'm thinking about like Disney Pixar's Turning Red. If you want to talk about like real life stories, last year I read Jeanette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died. If you're not familiar, Jeanette is a child actor, and her book details abuse at the hands of her mother, but also in a way that people may not expect. This video in particular is not going to be a review, but what I thought was interesting about Jeanette's story is the fact that from the outside looking in, her relationship with her mom seemed fine and it could come across as loving and supportive, but when you peeled back the layers, we can see that there's a lot more going on. I'm even thinking about over the past few years, I've been very invested in the Gypsy Rose Blanchard story, and that's more of an extreme case, but I do think it taps into this idea of normalizing complex relationships with the parent. Because even in some of the interviews that I watched, Gypsy talks about how she actually like loved her mom. She didn't want her mom to die, but her mother's mental illness was actively harming her daughter, and that's what led everything to unfold in the way it did. And even right now, I actually started reading Sherry Frankie's book, The House of My Mother. If you're not familiar, Sherry Frankie is one of the children of a family vlogging channel. Her mom recently went to jail or prison or something like that. So yeah, these are a lot of examples. I know like the last couple examples I gave are like maybe not of the same caliber because we're talking about like crimes, but I do think all of these stories that I mentioned, whether they're fictional or whether they're real, are bringing attention to the fact that mother-daughter relationships can be complicated, and it's not something that we're often used to talking about. Like even going back to Jeanette McCurdy's book, even reading the title of it, I'm Glad My Mom Died, evokes strong feelings, and understandably so, and Jeanette's explained why she named the book what she did. The whole point is you have to read it to understand it in full, but I do appreciate all these stories having these important conversations. I think for so long in the media, even, taking this outside of video games, there's only like a certain set of relationships that we're used to receiving depth and nuance. There's countless movies, books, TV shows about falling in love and romantic partnership. And I feel like there's not nearly as much conversation about the myriad of other relationships that we can have in our lives, whether that is friendship, which we see evident in Max's story with the first game with her and Chloe, and in this last game, her and Safi, albeit I do think they could have, written the story better and more effectively. It was definitely interesting, I guess, to have a relationship focal point that wasn't necessarily romantic. And I know Chloe is kind of an exception. It depends on how you took that game. But let's just use Double Exposure for an example. Max and Safi being friends and having that be the focal point of the story. I definitely wish that more forms of media would, explore these different types of relationships further and understand that there are interesting stories to be told there that does not necessarily include a love interest. But going back to Safi and Yasmin's story in Life is Strange Double Exposure, I do think that the writers kind of had something interesting there that they started but just didn't quite finish. I definitely would have loved to see more depth to that relationship and Safi's feelings about it, hear Yasmin's perspective on things. I think also the unique connotation of their culture being Arab, I think would have been also something interesting to explore. I think I noticed a lot of parallels in the types of things Safi was explaining, talking about kind of growing up with a lot of pressure and maybe having a overbearing parent. And again, I'm not from an immigrant family. I'm not from an Arab family. So feel free to chime in the comments if there's something you would want to add to this conversation. But from stories that I have read and people that I have interacted with, I've definitely heard similar sentiments of having a lot of pressure put onto you, especially if you're a child of an immigrant, because there's a lot of, obstacles and pressures when a family member decides decides to sacrifice to come to a different country. Sometimes there's like a cultural gap where maybe your child is growing up more Americanized and has a different perception of what a parent-child relationship could be that maybe the parent didn't have growing up in their native country. And so that could also be influencing the way that Yasmin is choosing to parent her daughter, even if it's to her daughter's own expense. That can definitely be a breeding ground for perfectionism and, you know, performing to always try to be the best that you can be, to not, you know, like disappoint your parents. And I think that is definitely something that can resonate with a lot of families, people who are immigrants, but also I think other minority families. Speaking as a Black woman, I definitely can relate to having parents or grandparents come from this perspective of sacrifice. I don't know about y'all, but in my family, there's some people that love to bring up segregation as a reason that we have nothing to be upset about in the present. And I can talk about this more later of why that's problematic, because although yes, we are not living in Jim Crow segregation, although we do have more rights, well, kind of, we'll see what happens with this current administration. But just because we're not living in those times does not mean that we cannot strive to be better, and does not mean that there aren't problems that still exist in our community. And actually, speaking of Life is Strange, when I played the first game, I talked a little bit about this idea of mental health and privilege not being mutually exclusive, and I brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Matter of fact, I'll bring it up here, but as we can see, we have all of these different needs, starting with physiological needs and safety needs, and then after those needs, there are tiers about love and belonging, self-esteem, and self-actualization. So as humans, we have all these needs, but I think sometimes, you know, coming from a marginalized community that has had a history of struggle and strife and oppression, they see that these two needs as like the cap. Because for older family members, sometimes these first two tiers of needs is all that they have capacity for and all they really have knowledge of, especially if you're in a mode of survival. And I think that's applicable not only for the Black community, but, you know, like I said, other marginalized groups as well. I think that can also apply to like an immigrant family such as Safi and Yasmin's. But it's important to see that there are other emotional needs that help us become successful and productive adults. And we need all of these needs achieved to really be the best that we can be and to be successful and functional members of our society. So I think it's important that we're having conversations about complex relationship with parents. And I think especially the mother-daughter relationship resonates with me. Well, of course, you know, I'm a daughter, so those types of things are going to stick out to me a little bit more. But I think oftentimes we put mothers on a pedestal. I don't want this to sound bad, but I think sometimes even when we think of like single parents, we often expect that parent to be the mother. And dads just don't have the same status in society, if that makes sense. Don't take this the wrong way, but I think y'all know what I mean. Like the difference between like sales for, let's say, like restaurants and businesses for Mother's Day versus Father's Day, there is a difference there. And not to say that like dads aren't important, like I definitely think a relationship with a father is equally important. But I think we have so many conversations about like mothers being strong and helping keep the family together and sacrifices that moms make. And although those are important, I think sometimes only focusing on those stories is doing us a disservice when there might be people who don't necessarily resonate with that, or people who may have grown up in abusive families, or people who their mother didn't actually meet their needs. And just because that is not something that you might have personally experienced, I do think it's important to, I don't know, take a step back when we're having these conversations about moms and seeing that moms are also people too. Yes, there are fantastic moms out there, but there also are people out there who don't have the best relationships with their moms, and their moms might have actually caused them more pain. So yeah, I hope this video makes sense. I guess I just wanted to get on here and talk about the relationship Safi has with Yasmin and just some of the, you know, parallels that I see in our current culture and society. I think it's very fitting that the book that Safi was writing that ended up getting canceled or pulled, as a result of her mother, might I add, was called The Daughters We Don't All Talk About. And although that book was about Maya and all that unfolded with her, I definitely think that's not a coincidence that Safi is the one writing it, because I definitely think that there is truth to that title within her own relationship with her mother. So yeah, I definitely think the media should highlight more types of relationships that aren't just romantic. So whether it is friendships, whether it is mom-daughter relationships, I'm all here for telling diverse stories. And I definitely wish that this dynamic with Safi and Yasmin was explored further in the game. Again, Life is Strange Double Exposure has its issues with the writing, but this is an aspect of the story that I did appreciate, and I definitely wish they would have delved more into. I'm looking at my notes here, and I wrote down this quote, which I didn't write down who it's attributed to, so I don't know where I came across this quote, probably from watching a YouTube video. But it says, neglect shows up in every area of your life, including your spiritual life. And I felt like that kind of just related to what we've talked about today, where if you have had needs neglected in your childhood, that definitely impacts you as an adult, and in more ways than one. So maybe some of the ways we've seen Safi kind of act out towards the end may not have made a lot of sense on the outside. I can see how having a lot of pent up resentment and perfectionism and constantly feeling like you have to perform, I definitely see how that can lead to what some might consider irrational behaviors later down the line. And that just further proves why we need to have more conversations, not only about, parents, but how we were raised and how it impacts us. Because if we don't process or come to some sort of healing with our past, it is absolutely going to impact our present. I definitely think this idea of silence is killing minority families. I definitely think there's a tendency to brush things under the rug or to excuse harmful or even abusive behaviors under the guise of like, well, I had to grow up fast, or this is the way I was raised, or as a parent, I was under a lot of pressure and stress, so the impact I had on you doesn't really matter, if that makes sense. And again, this is a layered issue. Although most parents are doing the best with the information that they have, that doesn't mean that you cannot cause harm onto your child that can impact them as an adult. And I heard this once, speaking even from like the child's perspective, although having trauma, whether it's inflicted from parents or other, adverse experiences, although experiencing trauma is not your fault, it is your responsibility to heal, if not to reconcile the relationship with the parent, because not all relationships are necessarily reconcilable, but healing is necessary to move on with your life or to move forward with your life. I like that phrasing a little bit better. So yeah, I definitely think it is important that especially BIPOC families are speaking to one another, that we're talking about the hard things, that parents apologize. I think it's important that new parents are being more cognizant of the impacts, the longer term impacts that they're having on their children. I think all of these types of things are necessary because, listen, a lot of us as adults now are reflecting on our childhood was like, that wasn't so great. That could have been done better. So I think using Safi and Yasmin's story as an example can show us a larger pattern of why doing that sort of work is important. All right, I've been talking for a while. I'm not sure how I'm gonna cut this video up, but thank you guys so much for watching. I'm trying to do better at doing more casual commentary that is less scripted. So this was definitely a more off the cuff video, but I hope y'all enjoyed. Let me know in the comments if anything I talked about today resonates with you. Do you have like a complex relationship with a parent or especially a mother? Let me know. And also, on another note, if you are interested in the Life is Strange universe, I actually did an interview with Alasia Gray, who voices Diamond's character in Double Exposure. We talked a little bit about how she got the opportunity to voice Diamond, but we also talked about her work and how she's very invested and has committed a lot of her career to the intersection of art and activism. So if my content is something that resonates with you, I definitely recommend checking out that interview. Alasia was one of my panel guests that I had for Kwanzaa Unwrapped, my holiday series that I did this past year. So go ahead and check that out. I'll go ahead and link it in the description. But all right, that being said, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Asmara, and I will see you guys next time. Bye everyone.